So the reality is that the world is moving to become more and more urbanized. By 2050, the world will mostly be in urban context. So it's essential that we tackle this reality of how do we see disciple making movements happen in urban contexts. In this video, David Broodryk shares on that topic. So unpacking the problem and the challenge facing us with urbanization and how that changes relationships, and then what that means for multiplying disciples and some specific strategies and practicals for how that works. So you're going to see that in this video, and we'll, in a conversational style, ask David some questions and pick his brain on how this has worked and what he has seen. So I hope this is helpful, and yeah, check it out.
I've been in ministry about 30 years and pursuing movements for about 20 of those years. And David Watson was really the first real mentor, movement mentor. And he walked with me for 10 years very closely. So that helped us to get movements off the ground. And we saw that happen in Southern Africa. And then we began to, primarily for me, it was the Eurasia region. And so across 16 countries in Eurasia, we started to see, major movements, 12,500 churches now. And then I began to ask, where next? And the whole idea of urbanization, the idea that people are moving to cities began to grip me. And it was really that chart on Wikipedia that shows, global urbanization, that was a United Nations chart. The European Commission has now done more research, and they say if you go by government definitions, then the UN is right. If you go by reality, which is where are the high densities of people, then the world's already 85% urban, and still rapidly urbanizing. So, I began to ask myself, what would it look like to reach the cities of the world, and why are we not seeing the cities of the world as the major mission force that it is? And globally, missions was just kind of defined by a mud hut, and I said, it's got to become a coffee shop, not a mud hut. That's where we've got to move. We've got to move to the city. And 10 years ago, that was not a very popular, just 10 years, just a short 10 years ago, it wasn't that popular a message. But, there were guys like Tim Keller in your neighborhood that were talking about cities long ago, but not necessarily movement. And so, just over the last 10 years, I've seen more and more awareness of this idea that if we lose the cities, we lose the world. We lose the Great Commission. We just don't win this battle. And it's fine to have a methodology that works in a rural village in Africa somewhere, and that should be celebrated. But if these statistics are right, we're looking at 30% or less of the world population that we're targeting with those strategies. And so initially people thought, well, moving to the city was just a shift of location, but it's not just a shift of location, it's a shift of culture. And so what I began to look at, and Mark alluded to it, was, the whole sociology of urbanization, which, is another term called urbanism, and urbanism refers to that culture that emerges when you create high density environments. And I kind of tell a story to illustrate that, and it's of some of our church planters in Madagascar, highly successful in the villages. They went to the city, and as on that journey, they actually change. So as they began to walk towards the city, no one talks to them. As they get closer to the city, no one talks to them anymore. In the village, everyone greeted them. But when they get to the city, they don't greet anyone else anymore. They actually start walking past people as if they're strangers. And what they illustrated to me is how urban culture changes us in ways that we don't even know or understand. And it changes our social networks. It changes how we relate to one another. And if movements are relational, and if movements are about the living word spreading through relational networks, and those relational networks completely change, then surely this has an impact on movement. And so I really began to research that. And the research wasn't purely academic. I got in an airplane and we held, meetings and sort of brainstorm sessions all over the world. We did one or two in Dallas, Texas. We did one or two in London. We did a couple in India. We did some in Russia. We did it in Africa. And we were wrestling through, so how does high density change social networks, and what does that mean for movements? And so as we began to understand some of those dynamics, we began to get a grip on the questions, and then slowly we've begun to get a grip on some of the responses and the solutions. And so we're now at the point where we've taken a lot of that research, a lot of what we've learned over those 10 years and the 10 years before, movements in general, and collated that into more systemic training that we're doing with people, and helping them move through some of those solutions. So that, in short, is the journey that we've been on.
Man, that's very helpful. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure there's a lot of different directions we could go in asking you questions. I'd love to ask one, and then as you guys have questions, why don't you just jump in? But one of the big chapters or passages that in missions we go to is Luke 10, where Jesus sends out his disciples, pray to the Lord of the harvest, that he raise up laborers, and then they go to the villages in the rural context there and look for that person of peace. And so I know from the stuff I've heard from you, you see that principle of person of peace, but then how that translates to the urban context looks different. So that, could you take that as kind of a jumping off point to talk about how has that translated in what you've begun to see and what you've learned from others in some of those brainstorming sessions around how to translate that into the urban context?
Yeah, so what you see there is a rural model with some principles that can be applied in an urban context. So Jesus has a team, and he sends them to every town and village where he was about to go. And they enter the village or the town first, and then they enter the house. And then they're told to look for a person of peace. That progression is actually very important. So there's a team that goes out. They go out 2 by 2. They enter the village first, then they enter the house, then they look for the person of peace. So in reading that, a lot of people got obsessed with the person of peace. And so they go start walking the streets looking for a person of peace. But that's not what Jesus tells them to do. He says, enter the village, enter the house, look for a person of peace. And so if we had to translate that to an urban context, you ask yourself, what does a village look like in an urban context? What is that? Is it the whole city? It's doubtful. So, we've got these sprawling cities of, tens of millions of people. That's a different context. So what is it? Is it a section of the city? Is it an urban village, that geographic area, neighborhood? And that's the first thing that we have to figure out. Where is Jesus sending us to? Which village is he sending us to? Well, as you begin to study urban sociology, you realize that people in high density environments over time do not relate to each other geographically. Relationships run in different ways, but geography is not one of them. And so to see a geographic area as a village is also a kind of a mistake, because the villages in the city look different. And so that took us down the road of what do these villages look like in cities? We actually now call them affinities, where people find affinity with one another. What do they look like in the urban environment? And that takes you down that road of urban sociology. So once you have got your head around what's the affinity or village that Jesus is sending me to, then I can begin the process of entering or looking for a house and finding the person of peace. If you don't do that, if you don't do it in that context, then what happens is you find random strangers on the street. You end up on a one-on-one evangelism process that never leads to movement. And so, again, that's just illustrating how the principles do apply, but you've got to put it in the context that you're working in. What is the context that you're working in? In an urban context, natural social networks run different. They're not the same as in rural contexts. So in a typical very rural village, people will associate with each other around common geography. They live close together and everybody knows their neighbor, and everybody knows everybody else in that geography, in that geographic location. And then you walk a few miles to get to the next village and everybody knows each other there. They also form common bonds around bloodline. They'll form the fact they're related to each other, or around ethnicity or language. That's what brings people together in a rural context. When you move to an urban context, all of that changes. And so typically cities were formed many, many years ago by young people moving to the cities primarily for economic reasons. So they get to the city and they're isolated because they leave their family behind. So social isolation, and as a result, suicide and depression is a big problem in cities. But people reform communities, and when they reform community, because God put community in the heart of man, when they reform community, they don't do it around geography, they don't do it around ethnicity, they don't do it around family or bloodline. They actually do it around common interest, need, or cause. So those three things are the way they form affinity in the city. They like the same things, they have the same problems, or they're fighting the same issues, whether it's, Black Lives Matter or Save the Whales, or, global warming, or, that all comes from one political spectrum, but you get the idea. They're fighting for something. So those are the things that bring people together in the city. That's the village in the city. So the first thing when you're asking, where is Jesus sending me to in a sea of 20 million people, is to ask myself, which villages or which affinities is he sending me to? And I've got to plant my work firmly inside of an affinity if I want to see movement happen, because that's the natural social network. That's the pre-existing community in that urban environment. And what I'm after is not winning the one, but actually seeing movement happen through those natural social networks. That's a mouthful, but I hope it kind of makes sense.
And as in our modern context, we look at that passage in the Great Commission, and we use the word ethne, and we see that Jesus has called the mission to go to all ethne. And in modern missiology, that's been really targeted in on people groups geographically, which of course are in cities. How do you see or process the reaching of people groups in urban contexts? Is it a byproduct of first targeting other affinities, where, and as people get to second generation, third generation, they're more connecting around common interest, common cause, and then that trickles back to reaching people groups? Or is there some other way that you see those things intersecting or overlapping?
Yeah, the people groups is something that's imposed on the word ethne. It's not inherent in that word. And it's not a bad conclusion. It's not a bad deduction, because historically that's how people, segregated themselves, was by major people groups. So that's not a bad thing. It was a good thing when the missions world realized that we're not talking about nation states here. When, the New International Version says go into all nations, we're not talking about, Spain and Russia and Finland. We're talking about people groups. So that was a huge breakthrough. But what we're finding now is a massive shift in how people associate with one another. And so we've got to go back to the word ethne. The word ethne does not inherently say people groups. That was a deduction, a good deduction, but it was still a deduction. The word ethne inherently, you just have to open up a Strong's Concordance and you'll see that it refers to how people move together in any way that they move together. So like a herd of buffalo or a flock of birds, or, give me another, swarm of bees would move together, swarm or flock or herd together. And that's what it refers to. So when it says go to all ethne, it's saying go to all of these ways that people group together and herd together and make disciples of all of these groups of people. That's the inherent meaning there. So if that is people groups, if that is the way people are flocking, then that's exactly what we should be doing. However, urbanization and urbanism is changing the game. And so what we're finding in cities is less ethnicity causing the flocking, and a lot more other factors causing the flocking. Well, that's then what we've got to go after. We've got to adjust to what we find, because those are the new herds or the new flocks or the new swarms that people are moving in. And so you've got subgroups. If you're working with UPGs in cities, you'll know that they often come into the city and form a sub-community that often is geographic, and they're sitting in a certain part of the city, refugee communities especially. And you've got these literal urban villages that geographically are almost isolated from everywhere else, like a Chinatown or Somaliland. And there they are together. But you'll also know that within a generation, it begins to change, and their children start going to school with other children in the city. And this mix starts to happen that, even though I've never been to New York, I would imagine this mix begins to happen. And people start to find each other around other commonalities. And it happens particularly in the youth. And so sociologists talk about urban tribes that dress the same, act the same, but come from different nationalities, but they like the same music or the same pop star, or they're following the same fashion trend of some kind. That kind of trend is massive, especially amongst young people. And it slowly begins to shift that delineation of tribal affinity. And people move away from that slowly towards these new affinities. So the issue is, it's not about creating something, it's about what do you see happening in front of you. If what you see happening in front of you is purely geographical and strongly geographical or ethnic, then that's what you go for. But if you see this mix and integration happening, and young people being influenced by, an American pop idol versus their parents, and you start seeing this massive shift happening, what you're seeing is a breakaway swarm or herd that's happening. And that's now a new affinity that needs to be reached. And that may not sit tightly within one single traditional people group. But movements work the same way everything does. The gospel spreads the way good news spreads, bad news spreads, fake news spreads. It spreads through natural social networks. You can't force those networks. They're either there or they're not. You observe them, and then you ask yourself, what would it look like for the gospel to spread through these relationships?
So can I just trying to wrap my head around this a little bit, because when I'm thinking about this, I think I'm confused by I see both. Like, so meaning in the youth or in the younger generations, you do see them pulling away from their traditional culture. But then you do see those strong gatherings or enclave of people from the first generation still, that are still, they swarm together in those interest, cause, and everything. So I see the separation of both. So I feel like a tension of confusion of like, how do you navigate that? And so where are you looking for the streams to hit? Because I in my head I see both in the city. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So here's the thing. It's the number one challenge of cities. If you say, what is the biggest problem with reaching cities? What's the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge is complexity. And cities are incredibly, paralyzingly complex. And so there is nothing that I can say that would be a global truth. Nothing. I can't say cities work this way and it's just true everywhere. There's nothing I can say except these overarching ideas and trends. And then you've got to look at your local context and go, okay, so how much of this is happening and how much of that is happening? It's always percentages, and it's always so hopelessly complex that you can't quite wrap your head around it. So then we need a way to navigate complexity. And that is then the next challenge that we have. And so when you look at how can I reach my city, when you want to answer that question, you come head to head with complexity. And you have to figure out a way to take on complexity. Villages are simple. You reach this little village there, it's there, you put a church there, you can consider it reached in the typical UUPG type of thing. It's reached, there's a church. So let's go to the next one. Let's go to the next one. There's a simplicity about that's almost linear, go from A to B and we've arrived at our goal. Cities, there's no ways. Cities are unbelievably complex. And complexity is one step further from complicated. Complexity means it's so complicated, you will never understand it. If you spend your life trying to understand it, you won't understand it. So to navigate complexity takes a whole new set of rules, a whole new way of building movement to the way that we built in simplicity.
That makes sense.
So I'd love to shift to some of the how part, but before we do that, Scott, Chad, you got any questions you want to throw out?
I was just gonna similar, like the question about diaspora, how do you look at that? But it looks like that was already answered, David. Thank you. I think, yeah, similar, like the focus part. I know like the YouTube video I watched, like part of the training that you guys do is help people like identify that focus. And it sounds like, you know, just paying attention where the people were, the communities within city, but in the New York is complex. It's so dense, those, you know, thousands of people in a neighborhood, and that's like, you know, 5 blocks. So I'm thinking just like, how do you help determine where that focus area is, and then help others kind of identify like that focus area for them because of the complexities of living in such a dense urban city?
Well, you know, when we started to navigate complexity, I tried really hard. I actually got in some helicopters, I flew over the city, tried to understand it geographically, bought some maps from the local government, put them out there, try to get my head around. Eventually I realized that there's just no ways. It, like you said, you know, every nation in the world is living down the road from you. And South African cities are not unlike New York, that we're so multicultural. And, you know, there's no ways you can wrap your head around it, because these networks just run in so many different directions. And so I kind of went back to the drawing board. It was a long prayer mission. I said, God, how can I reach something I can't even understand? How can I do something if I can't even get my head around it? And the Lord actually took me back to a statement that Henry Blackaby made famous. And he said, our job is to see where God is at work and join him in his work. And so I said, okay, well, what does that mean? How do I figure out where God is at work? How do I figure that out? And, you know, as I began to reflect on that more, I realized that everywhere through scripture and history, church history, when God's about to do something, he was raising up a person, always. He was raising up a Moses, he was raising up an Abraham, he was raising up an Esther, he was raising up somebody because he was about to do something. And so how is God at work? How can we recognize him at work? What we recognize is that he is busy doing something in the heart of somebody. And so instead of me trying to understand the whole city, my primary role became find those people that God is stirring in. And they're going, I want to reach this people. My heart breaks for this people. I want to reach that group of, in other words, there's all these affinities. What is God busy doing to raise up what we call champions, movement champions for those affinities? And so I began to search for those movement champions. And took us a while to figure out how to find them. We train people on how to find them now, but now we can't keep up with them. They're just jumping out everywhere, and they can be saved or unsaved. But it's the fact of the matter is that God is already at work in your community, in your city, in your part of the village, whatever it is. God's already raising up people with a heart for those specific groupings and affinities. He's already doing it. And if we could find them and find a way to equip and empower and get behind them, then we can actually reach the city. Not because we're clever or intelligent or because we got all the maps or because we understand it all, but because we've got a process. God's given us a process to reaching the city, and that's to find those champions.
Yeah, I'm super interested in the how as well, but are there other individuals, David, or resources, books, organizations that you just recommend that are kind of pioneering the way of movements in cities?
You know what, we've arrived where we've arrived through snippets and sections of different books and resources. So it's very hard to recommend an entire resource. It's kind of hard to do that. I'm working with, obviously working with people all over the world. I serve on New Generations, which is the ex-city team group, worked all over Africa. So we part of that team that got those movements going, and Steve Addison, you mentioned, and a lot of those guys. But at this stage of the game, still, a lot of what we're doing is unique in the sense of addressing this particular urban challenge. Now we are influencing a lot of people, and so there are mission groups all over the world. We're actually training teams in 47 cities at the moment. So those will start to learn and build their own trainings, and so there'll be a voice eventually. But at the moment, that voice is no, it's not. You're not going to get. I don't know of anyone speaking with the same voice completely.
So I've heard the stat there are 1,300 known active movements or so right now. Do we have any idea how many of those are in cities?
Yeah, that's probably Justin Long's statistics.
Yeah.
From is it?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I would guess it's Justin's statistics. Yes, there would be in the cities, but again, what we're talking about is not a geographic location. And so there have been guys that say to me, well, we've got movements going in cities. And then I go, well, this is an isolated immigrant community that acts like a village. And just because it's geographically planted right next to a city does not mean that you have any chance of actually impacting that city. And so, in city can be a very confusing term.
David, could you speak some, you mentioned that you've pulled snippets from different places. I've seen some of your content in different YouTube videos and different places on some of that how piece of how you've thought through the structuring of teams. And then you even highlighted from Luke 10 of the role of a team going in to engage. Can you talk a little bit about that process of the how piece?
Yeah, so what we typically do is we work with and this is language that we've formed. We stay away a little bit from what would be the pure English translation of terms like pastor, evangelist, apostle, because those terms are so strongly understood by different denominations and streams that we get into trouble no matter what we say. So we've invented terms around roles. And we say to people, take those terms and plant them wherever your faith background allows you to. But we talk about a city catalyst, and that's essentially somebody that says, I want to reach complexity. So I want to see, let's say, young people, old people, business people, poor people, all of these different groups in my city or section of the city reached. So that's someone that's looking at complexity. And that's their primary job of a catalyst, is to look at complexity. The only way they can reach complexity is to raise up people we call movement champions to reach all of those different subgroups or affinities. So we usually work with a city catalyst and a team of champions, and we take them through a journey. So the journey is about 2 years, more or less. We do an introduction to God movements where it's 6 weeks long. We introduce people to some of the concepts. If they're interested, they can go further. If they're not interested, hopefully they gain from those 6 weeks. None of this we charge for, by the way. So this is not a selling. I'm not selling anything here. But so we take them through the 6 weeks. If they're interested, we take them further, and we walk a 2-year journey with a city catalyst and a team of champions. What we found with movements is there's a lot of movement stuff out, especially in the West, that is extremely short-lived. You know, I was speaking to a guy yesterday and he said, well, you know, I've been in this 5 years and almost nobody that I started with is around anymore. It's very, very short-lived. And because I think there's not enough attention given to the development of that main team, those key leaders. And so we have 8 modules that we're taking through. The first 4 modules are focused on the individual and the team, just building and strengthening the individual and the team. I think someone here mentioned focus. So one of the modules is focus, and it takes them through 6 weeks figuring out what is the affinity, what is the group of people that God has prepared you for. And if you think you know, we're going to strengthen that. If you don't know, we're going to help you find that. And we want at the end of that 6 weeks for every person to come out and say, my heart beats for this group of people. We actually can't impose that on people. That's something that God stirs. And God has been doing with someone since they were born. So the keys, sometimes the clues to what they're called to is found in their story. And so we help them understand that. Once they've got that clarity, we move from focus to envision. So we help them to build and develop a strong vision for movement in that group of people. We move to surrender, where we figure out how do we live the lifestyle of being a disciple before we go out and make disciples. Because there's a tremendous amount of people, unfortunately, in the movement world that are telling other people to do things they don't live themselves. And so surrender deals with that. And we deal with some of the issues around cities. There are a whole bunch of other issues like time. Time is a huge, huge issue in the urban environment. People have the sense that they have no time. Busyness is massive. So we touch on some of those things. Then we do a module called Align, where we help a team to work together. This is not sequential, so we can do any of these modules at any point in time. Then we move to the work out there, where we talk about engage. How do I actually engage the brokenness of the people that, of the affinity that God's called me to? So we have a set of movement principles, 12 of them. And one of those is the kingdom of heaven moves towards brokenness and lostness. And so sometimes we only want to engage lostness, but we don't want to engage their brokenness. That means that we're talking to people that we don't have the permission to talk to. People will only give you permission when you engage their brokenness. So how do we move towards their brokenness? Engage. How do we move towards their lostness? Disciple. And so, you know, there's 4 modules that focused on the work out there. And we've found that you really have to pour into that first what we call pioneer team. So we would typically, we're working in 47 cities, but we only work with pioneer teams. So in a particular city, we'll work with one team, and we'll help them to contextualize the training and the language to multiply it in their city. We're not interested in working with, you know, hundreds of teams in that city. We only work with the first pioneer team to help them take it further. So I think I might have deviated from the question, but that's what we do.
Could you unpack some of the methods piece, or like the specific when you're coaching people to go to find the champions and to begin to engage? Can you paint a picture of what that looks like? We do this, then we do this, then we do this.
Yeah, so we have a process which I'm trying to call up here, but I can't find it right now. So we have different tools that we help people, you know, that we've developed over the years. One of those is, how do you find a champion? So we've honed that down to a 1-hour conversation. So within 1 hour of speaking to anybody, I can tell you if that's a champion or not, and if that's somebody that God's been working with or not, and if it's someone who I should recruit onto a team or not. And so we call that a humble inquiry. And the humble inquiry process is 5 simple questions that we sit and we take them through. And it begins with, so what are you excited about? You know, what excites you right now? And just having them talk that through, you know. And it ends, the last question begins with, so how can I help you in what God's calling you to do? So it's very, very simple questions, but then we train the catalyst on how to listen to the answer to those questions to discern, is this a movement champion for an affinity, or is it not? So there are multiple tools like that through the process. And Discovery Bible Study remains one of the key tools. We use that as well as one of the methods. In the focus module, we do a life plan process where we listen to people's story and we help them identify from the key points, listening to God, what is their contribution to movement, their maximum contribution, and what is their maximum role? Where does God want them to be? What is their calling? And so calling and contribution are what we mine out of them in that focus module. So every one of these modules has got multiple tools attached that we've developed, but they're generic. So anybody who goes through the training, we don't copyright or trademark the training, by the way. So anyone goes to the training, we then give them the training to reproduce in their own context, and we will come alongside if we need to and help you contextualize it. So we're, at the moment it's being done, different nationalities, different parts of the world. And then we work with teams to contextualize it in their particular context. But we're finding very little contextualization at this stage because the tools have been tested over time in multiple cultures.
Are you currently training any teams in New York?
In New York? No, actually not. We are training in the US, but not in New York. So no, I'd actually love to get to New York sometime.
Where are some of the urban cities that you're training in the United States?
They are in Dallas. They are in Houston. There is. I don't have the exact list in front of me. Because we've got different trainers on different calls, so I'd have to pull the list and have a look.
Most of this is on Zoom, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it is on Zoom. Most of the teams that we are working with, we've actually had face-to-face contact with. I've been to the US probably 30, 40 times for long periods of time, so I've got lots of relationships. And so a lot of it comes relationally. Teams that we know over time that have now recruited champions and they're ready to go on the journey.
Could you talk, David, about how you have, how you've developed and contextualized what church looks like and the role of church in urban contexts?
The church question is always interesting. What is church? I have a group of pastors not far from here that once sort of called me in because I was talking about planting churches, and they said to me, sort of sat me down, this kind of Spanish Inquisition, and they said to me, "Tell us your definition of church." And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what." And I knew they're all from different denominations and backgrounds. I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll give you an hour. If you guys can agree on definition of church, I'll tell you mine." And they took 2 hours. They couldn't agree on any definition of church because scripture doesn't really do that. It doesn't really try to identify church as some kind of entity. So honestly, we've come down to the most basic, simple definition of it's the people of God on the mission of God to establish the kingdom of God. That's it. So what does the expression of that look like? The expression of that looks very different in every context. And so when we work with a champion, we help them figure out what does church look like in your context. So we have everything from house church networks to, things that look like missional church networks, things that look like, pure discovery Bible study groups, others that are large churches. We've got a lot of large churches we engage, large churches that have started movements on the side that are slowly impacting the big church. So we've got all of those things going at the same time. And I'm not as worried about multiplying models as I am about how does it look like for the kingdom to come in this particular context.
That's a great response. Very helpful. I know you have used one of the words that you used around church, and you used that idea of saying we want to choose words that don't have history and baggage attached to them. But one of the words that you've used is gathering, and you've talked about the gatherings. And sociologically, I know I'll just frame it up the way that I've understood it, and then you can tell me if this is not how you understand it. But that there's at least these three levels that we connect: the private space, more of the public space, but then that middle size that's more of a tribal social space, 20, 30 to 70 people approximately. Is that how you've understood some of the role of one expression of church, which you've called gatherings in urban contexts? And so is that true? And then how is that the practical side? Could you unpack how that's kind of looked for you guys?
So yes, we do have gatherings. We have three movement structures we usually talk about: teams, groups, and gatherings. And those are just generic names to identify. A team is a group of people working towards a specific purpose. A group is typically a much smaller, under 18 probably, that are discovering God together in some way. And a gathering is typically that larger group of people, 20 to 120, somewhere around there, that meet together regularly. What I want to be careful of, though, is to define church by anything that is not necessarily a biblical definition. And so one of those is, we can't define church by a pulpit. We can't define church by a building. I'm not always sure we can define church by a meeting. And so, the fact that people meet or don't meet doesn't define whether it is or isn't church. Now, I think meeting is critical and key, and do not give up the gathering together of the saints is something that if everyone throws at me, and I think that's very true. However, if church was defined as a meeting, then coronavirus basically wiped church off the face of the planet, because meetings stopped, but the church continued. And so, you've got to be careful to say, so why did the church continue when meetings stopped? So is the meeting church? You start going in circles when you start, wrestling with these concepts. So the essence of church to me is the people of God on a mission to establish the kingdom of God. There are some critical things around that. They need to meet. They are healthy when they have leaders. They should multiply. There's a whole lot of essential elements to what is healthy church, but is not necessarily the essence of church. So when we talk about movement structures, we talk about teams, groups, and gatherings. All three, in a sense, are church. But teams are those focused work groups, often leadership groups, evangelistic, apostolic, champions, catalysts, whatever. They're working together for a purpose. Gatherings are your smaller disciple-making contexts. Groups are your most effective disciple-making contexts. And then gatherings. And then when we train people in what we call shepherding insights, we train them on how to count those structures and then measure the quality of those structures. So we want to measure, are certain critical elements taking place, like worship, is disciple-making, is nurture, is evangelism or mission taking place? What are those key things needed to take place for health to be there? But I want to stay away from the traps of using some of the traditional language and redefine some of those. And at the same time, not deviate from what Scripture says. So it's a bit of navigation to get there.
That's really good. Could you take a minute and just paint a picture from a specific case study or example, or even you could just make it up, but of how that could look as a team identifies a segment, they begin to engage. How does they begin from there? Do they gather into that gathering, or is that they begin to start groups that they gather together? How does that look practically? Could you paint a picture from a specific example, or just share an idea of how that could look?
Yeah, typically it's a team. It's a team that would, get together and start groups. Typically, you don't start big structures, you start small structures. So you start with 2, 3, 4, 5, your oikos, or your household is what you're starting with. Whatever that looks like, again, in that context, doesn't always mean a family, a traditional nuclear family. But your oikos evangelism is what you're doing, and you're taking them through a discovery journey of who Jesus is. And it's a disciple-making journey. So you've got a team, and they've got groups going. Over time, however, let's say you've got 20, 30 groups going. And let's say those groups are an average of 8 people, which is the average size for a group generally. So let's say they've all got 8 people, and you've got 10 going, so you've got 80 people, but they're all isolated from one another. What tends to happen, because part of what happens when we come to faith, when we're on that journey to faith, is we're seeking to discover who God is, but we're also yearning to discover other people on that journey. And so they start saying, well, I know these 8 people that are on this journey with me, but I'd like to know others that are on the same journey. I want to broaden my network. Where are these other believers that I can meet, that I can associate with, that I can say, these are my people? They begin to yearn for that. And as they do that, we begin to say, well, there's actually a lot of other groups, and we could at some point get together and you could meet them. Part of that is just sociological. So if in a small group you've got 3 couples, the men may get along, but the wives may not get along. Or let's say the couples get along, but one of those couples has got young children and the others don't. And those young children are looking, to associate with other young children. So sociologically, if we start looking for community, it's not that easy to build all the elements of healthy community in a tiny micro group. And it's at that point where you say, just the micro group is not enough, that we start to go down the journey of moving beyond just teams and groups, and we start saying, what do gatherings look like? And gatherings can take on lots of different expressions. You could meet together weekly, or you can meet together monthly, or you can meet together, 4 times a year. Lots of different things could happen, and those don't have to be church services. They can be all kinds of gatherings that get together. So it's at that point in a movement that you say it's healthy now for people in these groups to begin to meet one another, because in that you actually begin to strengthen the entire movement, that you begin to form these different gatherings.
That's very helpful. So you are emphasizing that it starts in the context of discipleship and mission and builds on that versus the gathering piece being first. I was just going to ask around these specific ways of engagement that I believe you've shared of live, work, learn, serve, and online, and ask you to speak into some of that specifically of what have you seen that look like in cities? How do you train people to find or engage people where they live, where they work, where they learn, where they serve, or online?
Yeah, well, the first thing you got to help people figure out is what's the affinity that Jesus is sending them to. What's that village? Once you have that, you have to ask yourself, where's the best place? So who do I engage and where do I engage? So what's the best place to engage them? And those 5 spaces are then what we talk about. Is it best to engage them where they live? Is it best to engage them where they work, where they play, the 3rd spaces, where they learn, universities, schools, colleges, or where they surf online? So where's the best place to engage them? And we go through a process of trying to figure that out. Different affinities are going to engage with you well in different spaces, and each of those have pros and cons. So your home, for example, I talk to house church networks and I go, house churches are great. I love house churches. I've started house churches, but they are not necessarily evangelistically any better than large churches. In fact, they're worse, because if I were not a believer, if I were far from God, I would much rather walk into a big crowd where nobody knows my name than into a group of 8 people that are going to ask me deep spiritual questions. I don't want to walk into somebody else's house where they're going to interrogate me. And so sometimes homes can be very threatening places. In big cities, which I would imagine New York would be one of those, homes are increasingly seen as private spaces. These are not places where people socialize. They socialize out in the restaurants, but not necessarily in the homes. That's true of my city. And so it may or may not be true in your city, but if it is true, that makes the home not necessarily the best place to engage with people the very first time. The workplace, in some places, the workplace has been amazing for engaging people. In other places, it's kind of close to illegal or illegal to talk about spiritual things at the workplace. The same can be true of schools or universities. People say to me, well, we can't engage schools in the US. Well, that's partially true. There are actually lots of people engaging public schools with Christian programs in the US, but there are ways to do that that don't get you into trouble. And then, where they play. So in the gym or in a public park or wherever they are when they're not at home or at work. That's where people form very, very strong relationships. So that's a really good place to engage with people. And so you've got to look at all these spaces and ask, where's the best place to engage the particular affinity that God's called me to?
And I like that, David. You keep coming back to really you're drawing us back to the principles of how God did it through Jesus, through the book of Acts, that it is about the person, the Moses, the Paul, the person that God raises up, and not necessarily just the affinity or people group. When you're looking for where God's at work, and I like that you highlighted that from Blackaby, are you guided primarily by finding that person that God is using and is on? Are you guided by seeing where there is lostness and need? Or is it a combination of those things? Is it the team that God raises up, you just start with, and I know you highlighted this, start with their oikos, and then it'll connect with other people as you go? Or is it a combination of those things?
It's a combination of those, but I cannot start in an affinity. I can't start in a movement in an affinity until I find the person who God has been raising up. The John Stott that says, "Give me Scotland or I die." That person that says, "Give me this affinity or I die. This is what I live for." Until I find that person, I can't start a new work, because I'd be stepping into territory that I'm actually not equipped to handle. And as the movement grows, I could probably find a person apiece, get a group or two going. But as that takes off, I do not have the capacity or the ability to guide that, to grow it, to work with it. And so I'm actually doing something pretty irresponsible if I start something without that champion there.
Yep. David, quick question. I think you may have touched on it a little bit as far as, I think you called it a city catalyst to kind of look to find the champions. So I guess what are some things you're looking for, like as far as like working with a team or with a city catalyst? What would be some things that you would look for best use of your time, obviously, and for the team?
Yeah, again, I'm looking for a calling. Is this something that the Lord is doing? That is primary for me, and that is revealed in the history of the person, what God is, the journey that they've taken them on. Often there's a degree of experience there, so this is not a person just new to the faith, in terms of being a city catalyst. They have the ability to network widely. They have the ability to work with other people. They have the ability to put together a team. And so we don't train a catalyst unless there's a team. And that's just a qualifier for us. So you actually, in the train, there's no finite list. So in the training, we actually talk about that. And we have everybody on the call, to kind of set up that list. What does a catalyst look like? And although every call is unique, some qualities come up that are actually quite similar to each other. But the litmus test is, is there a calling? Is God, called us to it? Is there a passion? Is the timing right? And can they assemble that team?
When you talk about team, is there strength in size? Meaning, is something too big? Is something not big enough as far as units?
It always starts somewhere. So, it could be 2, 3, 4 people. Typically with us, if someone comes to us with a team of, let's say, 3 or 4 people, we may join them in a training context with another smaller team, simply because we are under-resourced in terms of trainers and time. Typically, if a team is larger, let's say 10 or more, then we would give dedicated time to just that catalyst and that team. But everything starts somewhere. It's really more about the quality of people that you have around you. And I was on a call this morning with someone from New Zealand, similar conversation, and actually 2 people from 2 parts of New Zealand, and they were going, well, we don't have a team. What do we do? And I said, well, take this as a challenge to go get a team. That's the first step to building movement. The first thing Jesus does, what's one of the first things he does after turning water into wine? He goes and finds a team. He goes and calls, and how does he do it? He goes and prays all night, comes back, starts calling people, says, follow me, and he starts assembling this team because he knows that he's not even going to go into this 3-year ministry period without a team around him. It's just that very, very first step that you take. So it's where you move from talking about movements to building movements, is where you're actually beginning to assemble that team.
All right, guys, I hope that was helpful for you. And if it was, take a moment to subscribe to this video, check out other content we've got on the channel. And hopefully we'll get to talk with David again and get some more of his thoughts on this absolutely an essential subject that we tackle in 2021 and beyond. So bless you guys.